Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's Public Subsidy Board. I am New York State Department of Labor Commissioner and Chair of this board, Roberta Reardon. I want to say thank you to my fellow board members for joining me today. Quorum has been established. For those of us joining remotely through Zoom, you have been muted upon entry and you will remain muted throughout today's meeting. There will be no public testimony during this meeting and any distracting video will be disabled. Members are joining this meeting from 4 physical locations connected by video conferencing in New York City, Buffalo, Peekskill, and Albany. This is an open public meeting in compliance with the meetings law, and it is being recorded. The recordings are available on the Department of Labor's website. As a reminder, if any board member has written materials to submit for review or consideration, they must be submitted at least 24 hours in advance. Now I'd like to give all of my fellow board members the opportunity to introduce themselves. Let's start with the members who are here in Peekskill.
Hope Knight, President CEO, Empire State Development.
Laura Campion, Deputy General Counsel and Associate Commissioner, New York State Department of Labor.
Thank you. Now we'll go to New York City. Peter, would you like to start?
Peter Florey, President, New York State Builders Association.
James Whelan, Real Estate Board of New York.
Thank you. And our Albany location, Chris, can you start?
Public member.
Jill Archambault, General Counsel of the New York State Department of Labor.
Sean McCready, Secretary to the Board and Director of Public Work and Prevailing Wage Enforcement.
Aldo Catalano, Executive Director of the New York State Building Trades.
Laura Regan, Vice President, Eastern Contractors Association.
Joe Hogan, Vice President, Associated General Contractors of New York State.
Thank you. And in Buffalo?
Good morning, Deirdre Quain, Counsel's Office.
Thank you. Albany is a little low in volume.
I just turned it.
Okay, thank you. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are also joined today by Board Secretary Sean McCready and members of the department's counsel's office who are here to consult or provide guidance if we need a legal perspective at any point during today's meeting. Turning to our agenda, I will now ask Sean to provide us with an update on our board activities.
Members of the board, when we last met, there was an inquiry regarding the total breakdown for all the projects reviewed by the board thus far. Prior to today, the board has issued 25 determinations, with 5 of those projects being deemed covered and 20 not covered. In total, those 25 projects involve more than $2.9 billion in total costs and just over $890 million in public funding. Additionally, there was a total of $180 million of pilot savings, which accounts for roughly 20% of the total subsidies reviewed. As discussed at the last meeting, when publishing determinations going forward, we'll notate the applicable statutory subsection exempting projects determined as not covered. With respect to the projects for which determinations have already been issued, the following is the breakdown. 9 failed to meet the 30% threshold, 4 failed to meet the $5 million threshold, 2 were exempted by subsection B, not-for-profit developer, 2 were exempt by subsection CI, low-cost housing, 1 was exempt by subsection CII, supportive services housing, 1 was exempted by subsection F, urban development funding, and 1 predated the statute's effective date. Back to you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Sean. And for the folks in Albany, your level is a little bit low, so when you speak, just be sure you speak up so we can all hear you. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the adoption of the minutes from the June 26th board meeting. The minutes were provided to you ahead of this meeting and a draft is posted online as well. I move that we approve these minutes for the official record. Do I have a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion? Can we accept it without objection? Excellent. Thank you very much. Approved. Moving on to the next item of our agenda, our next quarterly meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, December 11th at 11 a.m. As we move into 2025, I'd like to let you know that we will be sticking to the cadence that we have established this year of holding our meetings on the last Wednesday of each quarter. Here are the dates for public subsidy board meetings for next year. Quarter 1, March 19th, 2025. Quarter 2, June 25. Quarter 3, September 17, and Quarter 4, December 10. The board will receive the meeting dates in writing, and meeting dates will be posted on the New York State Department of Labor's website as well. The next item on our agenda is to discuss the subtopics that came out of our discussion of the testimony that we received at the May 20th public hearing. The public hearing considered two topics: calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. We received input from experts, stakeholders, and other New Yorkers in person, virtually, or submitted written testimony. Following the hearing, during our last meeting, the board discussed the hearing topic of calculating tax savings. During that discussion, it was decided that the board required additional information regarding the following subtopics: when and how to use the present discounted value in calculating future tax savings, the average annual increase in property taxes in New York City versus New York State, and how to calculate the value of tax savings from pilot programs. We solicited feedback and we received 7 responses. This written testimony is available on the department's website and was provided to the board for review prior to this meeting. Beyond those submissions, the board secretary followed up with each contact to remind them of our request, and we did not receive feedback from all of them. We asked 15 contacts for additional information, and this is where we are. I am now calling on this board for help in deciding whether we need more information. I would love to learn from your expertise. As of now, the hearing is still open. During the public hearing, we heard a wide range of expert and public testimony on the topics of calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. I have given this a lot of thought, and I know all of you have as well. Let me explain further. First off, the use of a present discounted value, or PDV, is predicated on the assumption that money in the future is worth less than money today. Applying the present discounted value to estimated tax savings over time would result in a lower dollar value for the total tax savings that would be included in the 30% public funding calculation. The question to answer is, should PDV be used in the calculation? Second, it is generally understood that annual property tax increases in New York City tend to be higher than the rest of the state, where there is a 2% cap. That cap, however, can and is sometimes exceeded by localities. The current question is whether the different average annual tax increases significantly diverge, and if so, should New York City and the rest of the state be treated differently? Finally, the 2 previous questions brings us to the third. How do we ultimately calculate the tax savings from pilot programs, which can stretch out for 20 years? Should certain assumed tax increases and value adjusters be applied? Or should the estimated savings be left to each individual industrial development agency to calculate at the time that the pilot is awarded? In order to help the board consider these questions, we've taken your suggestions and reached out to a number of individuals and local IDAs for their input and written testimony on the subjects. Additionally, they were asked some specific questions based on board feedback. These questions were: 1, what conditions must be met and maintained to satisfy a pilot agreement for the various types of projects? Manufacturing facility, warehouse, retail development, housing development, and mixed use development. 2, under what circumstances are pilot agreements rescinded? And can you point to any examples where this has actually occurred? And 3, are there any land value tax jurisdictions in New York State? And if so, are pilot agreements different in those jurisdictions? With those questions, the goal here is to consider the new information, along with all the information we have provided since the hearing was opened on May 20th, 2024, and try to develop a recommendation to resolve the overarching question of how to calculate tax savings. Sean, can you please remind the board about the process?
Certainly. The board members may propose recommendations for consideration. I, as board secretary, will distill the recommendations in writing and provide them to the board for review and consideration at a future meeting. The objective of the future meeting is for the majority of the board to agree on submitting a recommendation to the commissioner for consideration. Assuming that the recommendation is adopted by the Labor Commissioner, the Department of Labor will then have to engage in rulemaking.
So does anyone have any questions about the process? No questions. Perfect. Let's remember where this discussion began. The three subtopics came out of a need for additional information based on the original two topics, calculating tax savings and calculating other funds. So let's talk about the written testimony that the board received. I reviewed the written testimony. I would like to hear the board's thoughts on the written testimony. And if the board thinks there is sufficient additional information based on all the written testimony that the board has received. So would anyone like to start the discussion?
Well, I guess I'll start, Commissioner, thank you. First of all, I thought it interesting and not completely surprising, although, you know, what you can garner from it across the board, I'm not sure. Just on the issue of the tax increases, you know, in all cases, tax increases don't occur. And being a former elected official, I understand that, particularly in an election year, you're not always going to be raising taxes. Now, that may be different between local electeds and school boards, and I understand that. But it's tough to assume tax increases, you know, based on that. That's on that point. You know, I also think that the net present value, I think, you know, that idea of it was validated. If you're going to count pilot savings as a public subsidy that can be calculated, you know, the net present value is certainly something that I think you know, should be factored in. I don't think that we should dictate the exact amount. Well, perhaps, you know, a cap may be appropriate. But I think in general, the IDAs, you know, should determine whether and to what degree they are going to factor in a net present value. You know, as far as the cap, one of the things I found particularly interesting was the testimony of, and I can't remember his name, Alexander Hall, looking at an approximate discount rate for multi-year projects to be equal to the current 30-year bond yield. If that's any kind of a clue, I don't know exactly what that sits at, to be honest. But I think that certainly looking at it on an IDA to IDA basis and let them determine what that net present value is going to be and whether that fluctuates, whether that's a year to year, whether that's a determination they make at the beginning of the year, or however they do that. I think we leave that to them, but perhaps, you know, set a cap. It can't be more than X. You know, seems to be an appropriate way to look at it.
Okay. Anybody else? Thoughts on the written testimony? Peter, did I see your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I would concur with Joe that the use of net present value is a widely accepted you know, financial model. It is used, you know, universally in finance. I think the bigger question really is, you know, how do you establish the discount rate that's going to be associated with that? And in my reading of what I saw from the IDAs, I saw a number of different opinions. But one that stood out was that, you know, the IDAs really should be the ones making the determination as to whether net present value is used and most definitely what the applicable discount rate would be. So I agree with Joe that that determination should be left to the IDAs. And in fact, I did go a little bit further and say that since they're the ones really who are establishing at the outset what the quote unquote benefits are, that they should also, as they do now, be the best determinant of what the annual tax increases are. So I think if we adopt that, that could really solve a lot of our question here. So if that's something that we want to explore, perhaps we could put that into a motion.
I have more of a question than a comment, and it really may be just for my edification. So when we talk about net present value, is that, so that's the current value of the property, and that remains static then for the lifetime of the pilot? Is that correct?
No, I don't look at it that way. Peter, you may be able to explain it better than I can, but it's looking at, the value of money and therefore the value of what that money is buying and being calculated therefore relative to the savings that are real savings based on the net present value. But as Peter probably can, living in that world more closely can probably explain it a little bit better.
Yeah, so what it really refers to is the benefits, the quote unquote benefits that are being received, that are accruing to a project, namely the difference between what the anticipated future taxes are going to be year after year after year and the pilot amount. So that differential is established each year for the entire duration of the pilot. And that could be, as was earlier mentioned, anywhere from 10 to 25. I've even heard as many as 30 years. So each year, the value of that in net present value terms, 5 years out is going to be worth less, even though it's the same dollar amount. It's going to be worth less today than it, when we're establishing what the overall benefits are. So it doesn't refer to the property itself, it refers to the benefits that are provided by an industrial development agency.
Right. I just want to remind everybody about our process. So the hearing is open. And if we were going to develop recommendations, there is a process for that, to do that. You can propose recommendations. Sean, as the board secretary, distills the recommendations into writing and provides them back to the board for review and consideration at a future meeting. The objective of the future meeting is for the majority of the board to agree on submitting a recommendation to the commissioner for consideration. And then assuming that I adopt the recommendation, then we go into rulemaking. So there is a process, and in order to do that, we have to close the public hearing.
Yeah,
correct?
so Peter, you had mentioned doing a motion, and I think we're a little before getting to a motion point, but at this point in the process, the board has the hearing open. Individual board members can start putting forth the outlines or sort of the structure of what they would like to propose for a recommendation. Sean then, I believe, has, under the procedures, unless the board modifies the procedures, Sean has, I think, 7 days from when the hearing closes to distill those recommendations into writing, send them back, and then this board has to meet within 3 weeks following the close of the hearing to vote on those proposed recommendations. So we wouldn't have a motion on any pathway forward yet. I'll also remind you that the hearing is on 2 topics, so keep that in mind as we're talking through that, we will need to deal with both topics. And you guys, I think, wanted more additional information on the calculating tax savings, but I don't want you to lose sight of that other open topic regarding other funds, which I think you didn't necessarily need more information on, but I don't know that you have any proposals that have been provided to Sean at this time, right?
And Madam Chair, I'd like
Yes.
to make a comment with respect to net present value, and knowing that it is an established methodology. I think it is something that we should, think about using going forward. The core issue for me is, discount rate has been stated. And I think that the discount rate that is used should be consistent across all projects. And,
Across the state?
across the state.
Can you speak to why that? And I just want to remind everybody, we're having this discussion, so this is a very complicated area. And I want to make sure when we say stuff that everybody understands what we're saying.
Yeah, I just think that the value of the cash flows are gonna be, it should be looked at consistently across the state. There aren't different interest rates. I mean, maybe there are, but there would be a minor differential. And so I think, consistent in valuation.
Got it. James? Or Jim?
Thank you.
sorry.
Thanks. I think the upshot of the testimony that was submitted is the Public Subsidy Board and the Department of Labor is not in the place, does not have the expertise to substitute the judgment of IDAs throughout the state unless there's a finding that the IDAs acted unreasonably or unwilling to cooperate with the board and the Department of Labor.
I guess that's an interesting point of view. How would we determine that they're not cooperating? They just wouldn't.
If you're not getting information from them,
Okay. So how would we proceed if they're not well, I actually think it would be two things. The IDA is not giving us the information we need, or a board member feels that they're giving us bad information, right? And then how would we proceed?
we'll have to deal with that at the time.
I think we'd have to figure that out in advance. Yeah, I think we'd have to have a process. Because you could get really buried in controversy very quickly. But that's an interesting point of view on this.
I think for discussion purposes, I think, interesting, there's a threshold question. The threshold question is whether to use net present value calculation. And I think in general, from the written testimony and discussions here, it seems to me that that's the way to go. The second question then is the how to set that, or again, as I said before, whether to set a cap on it or to the point made, or to actually set it ourselves throughout the state. And if we're going to do that, then I think then it gets a bit more complicated as to the how and what we set it at. Maybe easier to set a cap than to actually set the rate, on a statewide basis or a regional basis in the state. And that's where I get a little bit concerned, and I agree with Jim. Let the IDAs know their region and have the expertise there, but we don't want them to just run amok with it and set unreasonable numbers, unreasonable high. If they want to set low, well, I think that's something to deal with. But we could also look at a range in that regard. But I think the bigger concern about them being unreasonable or uncooperative would be more that they set it high simply to avoid the strictures of the law, at least relative to the pilots.
Right.
And the other concern, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just, the other concern is from what I read of the testimony is that there seems to be a, differing of opinion as to certainly not so much with the net present value, but with the discount rates. And my concern is if, we were to impose that, if the board were to impose a one rate that, IDAs who differed from that may take exception to that. And then how do we handle that? Do we impute that ourselves? And so it would not agree with their numbers then. But I think one of the ways in which I agree in a perfect world, it would be great to have one established rate, but I think it introduces such a level of complexity that we could spend a long time trying to determine what that would be. I think the easier way to go, better way to go would be allow the IDAs to make that determination. And as Joe suggested, perhaps impose a cap that, not to be exceeded, so that maybe as an example, the New York City IDA as their rate as a cap or something like that.
Right, because the New York City economy is really different from the rest of the state. I mean, that testimony, that's pretty clear. Do any of the other board members want to weigh in on any of this? Do you have questions? Do you have concerns?
I guess my concern would be the cap, not knowing much more than that. We wouldn't want to cap the value of, of the subsidy, and for obvious reasons, I think.
Anybody else? So I will say that I am not comfortable that I have enough information to make a decision at this point. And I would like to have some additional testimony, perhaps to the point about the impact of having one discount rate versus another approach. If you had a cap, what would that look like? And really narrow in the testimony. It's not such a broad question about how do you calculate it, but more specifically to the net present value and what the discount rate should be, and have them speak to us, because there was varied testimony in this last batch of, they were not in agreement by any stretch of the imagination. And perhaps we can narrow that question so that they can really speak directly to that, to those questions. And I hear you about having the IDAs make the determination. I'd like to hear from some of the people that have written about this, what they think of that idea.
Commissioner, to your point, and I'm not sure that written testimony is going to quite get us there. There are two firms. One provided written testimony this time, one I think previously, but two were kind of referenced as organizations that the IDAs rely on for these determinations. One is MRB, the other was, I think, Camoin. And it might be good to actually have them and really focus a hearing on determining that, where we can actually ask them questions and dig into some of the details. As I said, when I read, and perhaps Professor Heil as well, as I read about the 30-year bond yield as factoring into that, I'd want to actually be able to question folks, and then we can make a determination. As I said, I think it seems to me we generally look at the idea of yes, it should be calculated. Now the question is how, and I think that those organizations can help us get to where we need to go. I
appreciate that, because I would much rather talk to somebody than read their written testimony.
Right.
It's very hard. So I would like to ask Sean to collect any other questions that the board may have that we want to ask these experts. We don't have to give them everything, but it will be a back and forth. And if there are experts beyond the two concerns that you mentioned, and perhaps certainly the gentleman from Columbia, Professor Heil, if there are others that we would like to hear from in person, and then we can schedule them for the next scheduled board meeting. If there's written testimony that people want to submit before the board meeting, I would suggest that we get that to, I think the board needs to get their questions and suggestions to Sean by, I've lost my date, October 16th. I want to give dates so we're a little more organized on this. And then he can get that compiled and sent out to experts. We could expect responses by November 1st. And then if we get written responses, we'll get that out to you by November 11th. But then we will schedule the experts in person December 11th for our scheduled meeting. We might want to think about having, do we have to have time certain for the end of that kind of meeting? Well, this is an hour meeting, but.
I think this is actually scheduled for
all
2 hours.
2 hours,
But
okay.
They're generally open.
Open,
If it
okay.
goes more than
If it goes more, it goes more. You're in charge of your own time. But that would really be helpful because otherwise we're going to be sending paper back and forth. So if that meets everybody's expectations, does anyone have any other suggestions on this particular exercise? And
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, the testimony that's being sought is limited to the two questions you posed a few moments ago?
well, if you have other questions you want to ask, get them to Sean. I think to Laura's point, we have not actually discussed calculating other funds. I don't know that anybody feels the need for more information, but if there is information you need on that other question, certainly include that as well. I think that question is actually a little more self-resolving. It's the tax savings that we've been struggling with. But again, whatever your questions are, get them to Sean by October 16th. If they're written, we'll get those out to the experts by November 1st. If they send us written stuff, we'll get that to you by November 11th, and then we'll have the in-person meetings December 11th.
I just raise it just in the interest of looking to move the discussion along. So for example, you know, we had a period of getting testimony submitted on 3 questions. It wouldn't make sense to sort of reopen that process for those questions. So
If people want more information, they can certainly ask for it, but we have a wealth of information already. I mean, we have all of the written submissions and the hearing, the first hearing online. So if you can always go back and listen to the verbal presentations and read what they've given us. It's a lot. Trust me. But it's all there. But if someone, I mean, I'm not going to stop the board from asking questions because that's your function. If you really have a question that we've not answered, get it to Sean and we will look at it. Okay, so I think we're in agreement on this process. And this is actually a great conversation, and thanks, Peter, for making that recommendation, because that's where I was going to. I like it when you leave behind. So let's move to the next item on the agenda. Included with today's materials is a revised draft amendment to the board's process to identify potentially covered projects. This is a short amendment that starts on page 2, and it outlines circumstances where the board will decline to review projects that are either clearly covered or not covered based on the statutory thresholds and exemptions in Labor Law 224A. Sean, can you please review the draft amendment?
Yes, Commissioner. New subsection 4 would read, the board shall decline review if Bureau of Public Works determines that A, the total construction project costs equal $3 million or less, or the total amount of public subsidies equals 15% or less of the total construction project costs. B, total construction project costs equals $7 million or more, and the total amount of public subsidies equals 45% or more. And C, the project is exempt from being considered a covered project pursuant to one of the subsections of 224A4. Section 5, for matters in which the board declines review pursuant to Section 4 above, the secretary shall inform the board, the owner's developers, as well as the requester and any impacted public entities that provide information that A, the board has declined review pursuant to the policy and procedure. B, the Bureau of Public Works has determined that the project is either not covered in the case of sections 4A or C above, or covered in the case of section 4B above. And then C, that the board may choose to reevaluate a project in the future if new or additional information is discovered that would impact the application of section 4 above. And then the slight amendment to section 6 would be that for all matters not covered by section 4 above, within 30 days of Bureau of Public Works receiving a request for termination, the board secretary shall deliver to the board a report containing the submission form, the Bureau's preliminary findings, recommendations for any additional information that could be relevant to obtain before the final decision. There's no additional changes after that. I'm sorry. Section 6 anyway. And then section 10, in accordance with labor law section 224C5, determinations made by the board pursuant to this process shall be published on the department's website. Such publications shall include the following: project name, owner or developer name, project location, board determination, basis for determination, and date of the board's determination. And that is a summary of all the proposed changes.
Does anyone have any questions about the draft amendment?
Just a quick question on section 10 applies directly to the projects that the Department of Labor is going to determine, right? That's the whole gist of the amendment, but I just want to be clear that the changes to subject 10 apply to those projects that will be determined by the statutory or the threshold.
But this time would be for all, so it's really only adding the basis of determination to what we'd be publishing already for projects determined.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Great, so if they're, oh, Jim, sorry. Yep.
Thanks. With respect to the second proposed amendment, I'd suggest with respect to the basis for determination, that it be as concise a summary as possible just to minimize the possibility of disclosing any confidential or market sensitive information.
Yeah, so it would be along the lines of how I recap those projects we've done already. It would simply be the subsection. People can read the subsection if they want to know what it directly applies to, but it would not go into any detailed information, numbers, figures, or any kind of the information about the project itself.
Great, thanks, Sean.
Okay, so if we have no concerns about the language, I move that we amend the procedures as written. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, please raise your hands. Hands down. All opposed, raise your hand. Abstentions? Unanimous. Thank you very much. The motion carries. Okay. So at this time, I'd like to ask the members of this body if there are any other business to address before we move into executive session. Anything that you need to say in a public meeting? No? Okay, great. I am very happy that we have quorum today. I would like to remind you that if we do not have quorum, we cannot vote officially and it will delay projects. So just a gentle reminder to everybody, we need to show up for our meetings. It's our responsibility as members of this board to be prepared for the preordained dates. That's why I give them to you as far in advance as possible. During the next portion of our agenda, the board will be discussing specific projects that the board members received prior to today, consistent with the board's procedure and the confidentiality requirements set forth in Labor Law Section 224C5. I move that the board enters executive session. Do I have a second? Without objection? Excellent. Pastors, we will now be ending the live stream and closing the doors to the public to enter the executive session. When the executive session has been adjourned, we will reopen the meeting rooms to the public. I'd like to welcome back any members of the public who are attending today's meeting. 4 projects were presented to the board in executive session. and determinations were issued by the board for 4 projects. The determinations and the reason for which projects, if any, were exempt from coverage will be published on the Department of Labor's website, consistent with Labor Law Section 224C5. Again, our next quarterly meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, December 11th at 11 a.m. Please keep in mind there may also be additional meetings determined as necessary, but at the December 11th meeting, we will be asking for public testimony from specified people. As I mentioned earlier, the dates for 2025 have been set and they will be available online after this meeting. I think we're also emailing all of the board members, so you'll have it in front of you. We have now concluded discussing today's agenda items. Materials, including a recording of, will be posted on the boards and committees section of the Department of Labor's website. And as we've reached the conclusion of today's meeting, I move that we adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
Without objection. Thank you very much, everybody. That concludes our meeting. And again, I want to thank you for being here and for your service to this